Good morning, one and all, and a warm welcome to Day 2 of the Gordon Centennial Conference at Teachers College, Columbia University. I'm Madhavi Chatterjee, Professor of Measurement, Evaluation, and Education at Teachers College, and it is my great honor and privilege to moderate Session 3, titled Towards Next Generation Affirmative and Formative Assessments for Learning and in the Service of Learning. I hope you've enjoyed the conference thus far. Personally speaking, I was struck by the collective brilliance and the diversity of experiences and expertise that our panelists have brought to the table. This first panel on Day 2 promises to be as good, and we hope will make breakthroughs. Thanks to all the participants. I am so excited. Before I introduce the speakers, a couple of minutes to frame the problem. Let us draw again on the challenge that Professor Gordon places before us. Consistently, he has expressed frustration that tests and assessments that have dominated the fields of education and psychology where we work have been directed at measuring and quantifying the deficits in learners and learner groups, usually at the beginning and end points of learning, missing the mark altogether when it comes to understanding better the qualitative characteristics and needs of learners, failing to shed light on the dynamism and the diversity of the learning processes and pathways. From where I stand, having been in the fields of measurement and evaluation for some 30 years now, sometimes working in the same spheres and spaces as the terrific panelists we have today, the challenges we face fall into 4 buckets: dynamic versus static learning. And learning processes and diverse learner capacities change dynamically, and we need to design tasks. We need to rely or draw on mathematical and analytic models that capture these dynamics. We have for too long relied on models, psychometric models, scaling models that have forced mathematical requirements that see diversities in response data as misfitting data. We have to think in innovative ways and make certain breakthroughs there. The second area has to do with learners and facilitators of learning processes. These are human users of learning. Human users of learning. So the challenge is making sure that the assessments and assessment systems we think about are user-centered. There is, of course, the promise and challenge of data science and data analytics. When, under what conditions do we collect the data so that the data and the results are useful to support learning processes? And then the elephant in the room is, of course, validity. What data would we collect? What is the kind of evidence, and what would the data mean? Would it help us support learning relevant inferences? Can we make those meaningful inferences? So our third session has a stellar group. We are talking about affirmative approaches to assessment in the service of learning. Our first speaker is going to be Robert J Mislevy. Professor Mislevy is the Frederick Lord Chair in Measurement and Statistics at Educational Testing Service and Professor Emeritus of Measurement, Statistics and Evaluation at the University of Maryland. He earned his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1981. His research applies developments in statistics, technology, and cognitive science to practical problems in educational assessment. His over 200 professional publications include a 2018 book on socio-cognitive foundations of educational measurement. He has served on numerous National Academy of Sciences committees and national initiatives, including, of course, the Gordon Commission on the Future of Educational Assessment. Welcome, Bob. The title of Bob's presentation is going to be Transforming Assessment. Our second presenter in order is going to be Professor Ryan S. Baker from the University of Pennsylvania. Ryan is Associate Professor and Director of the Penn Center for Learning Analytics. His lab conducts research on engagement and robust learning within online and blended learning, seeking to find actionable indicators that can be used today, but which can predict future learning outcomes. He has been the founding president of the International Educational Data Mining Society and currently leads and edits many data analytics initiatives in the learning sciences. Welcome, Ryan Baker. The title of Ryan's talk is From Algorithmic Bias to Fairer Automated Algorithms in Education. Our third speaker is Professor Richard Duran from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Professor Duran is professor in the Gewurz Graduate School of Education, University of California, Santa Barbara. His research and scholarship has focused on intersection of cultural psychology, learning sciences, and theories of literacy intersecting with assessment of English learners and persons from culturally diverse backgrounds. He has served on many NAEP validity studies and panels, and is currently working on a white paper for NAEP. Welcome, Professor Duran. The title of Richard's paper is Learning and Affirmative Development from Socio-Cultural Perspectives, Implications for Notions of Assessment. Our fourth speaker is Professor Neil Kingston, who happens to be a TC alum. Professor Kingston is from the University of Kansas, where he is the University Distinguished Professor in Research, Evaluation, Measurement, and Statistics, a track in the Educational Psychology Department. He is also the director of the Achievement and Assessment Institute. His research focuses on large-scale assessment with emphasis on how it can better support student learning. He started his career as a high school teacher, has worked previously with the Educational Testing Service, and he was also the Associate Commissioner for Curriculum and Assessment in the Kentucky Department of Education. Welcome, Neil. The title of his talk is Destandardizing Assessments in the Service of Learning. Our fifth and final speaker is Professor Eva Baker from the University of California at Los Angeles. Professor Baker is the founder of CREST, which is a renowned R&D entity on assessment and game systems adaptable to users and the purposes in school, training, and informal settings. Her research has involved teaching, evaluation, technology, methodology, performance assessment, simulation, and innovative technologies. She's now focused on design and quality of assessment systems. She was a past president of the American Educational Research Association and the World Educational Research Association, as well as Division 15 of the American Psychological Association. She served as the co-chair of the AERA, APA, and NCME 1999 Testing Standards Committee. She is widely published and a frequent speaker and advisor on many national and international panels, and a long-term associate of Professor Gordon. Welcome, Eva. The title of Eva's talk is quite provocative. It is Assessment for Learning and Disrupting a Secular Trend. So there we are. That's our panel. It's actually disrupting a secular faith. That's even more provocative. Our distinguished discussant is Professor James W. Pellegrino. Professor Pellegrino is the Liberal Arts and Sciences Distinguished Professor and founding co-director of the Learning Sciences Research Institute at the University of Illinois, Chicago. His research and development interests focus on children's and adults' thinking and learning and the implications of cognitive research and theory for assessment and instructional practice. He has published over 300 books, chapters, and articles on these issues and served on several National Academy of Sciences studies. He is a lifetime member of the National Academy of Education and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So welcome, everybody. I am so delighted that you are here. We are going to go in order now, and as we proceed, we will, I will introduce you just before you present. Thank you. Each speaker will have about 15 minutes, and let's give the stage to Professor Robert Mislevy.
Working with Professor Gordon 15 years ago on the Gordon Commission. Toward the beginning of the meetings, he told us about what he'd learned as a psychometric assistant to a remarkable teacher, Elsa Hesserman, who worked with children with learning challenges. More than measuring mental function and categorizing children, he said, Elsa wanted to know how these children functioned and the correlates of their performances. She felt that what she would do to help each of them learn could be influenced by how each learner used what they brought to a learning situation. In this conceptual frame, the approach, he said, to assessment, teaching, and learning constitute a troika, consistently employed in the service of learning. So there have been advances along several fronts in recent years that help contribute to this vision. Research in subject areas, knowledge, processes, practices they encompass, how students coming from different backgrounds and experiences can develop them. Digital technologies for assessments that can address a much wider range of knowledge, processes, and practices. Big data, learning anytime, anywhere, how these all connect, again, with a diversity of students. And analytic methodologies, new from artificial intelligence, natural language processing, learning analytics, as well as breakthroughs in the more familiar areas of statistical methods and measurement modeling. I don't think that any of this machinery, though, is sufficient without a fundamental rethinking of educational assessment. With the right kind of thinking, major improvements can be achieved. In some cases, drawing on these developments, but in other cases, even without them. Here, though, are two fundamental developments that I do think are essential and are now beginning to occur. The first is an emerging synthesis of research from cognitive, sociocultural, situative, developmental psychology, which I'll call sociocognitive for short. We see complex adaptive systems of linguistic, cultural, and substantive patterns across persons, which mediate our practices and our interactions in the physical and social world. And we see learning as individuals developing cognitive resources attuned to these patterns, so they can recognize them, work with them, create them, resist them. All developed through their experience participating in activities built around them. So this perspective does support that integration of assessment, teaching, and learning that Professor Gordon advocates. The second is situated argumentation to understand assessments, all the way from informal ones like one-on-one conversations to formal ones like national assessments and licensure tests. Examples of these argumentation tools would include evidence-centered assessment design, as it's been extended to models of learning, models of activity, and things like games and simulations, theory of action and logic models, again, both as extended to and integrated with learning. Together, they hold implications for educational assessment, for educational testing, for educational measurement. And I haven't said the same thing 3 times. These terms are often used interchangeably, but there are important differences that make for different implications among them. I use assessment broadly for ways of obtaining, interpreting, and using information about students' capabilities and how they might develop for some educative purpose. So this spans classroom quizzes and projects and external standardized tests, intelligent tutoring systems, game-based learning, and unstructured discussions that teachers have with students. A test is a particular kind of assessment, predetermined tasks administered under predetermined conditions, with performances evaluated through predetermined procedures. Measurement situates results from an assessment in a quantitative framework, assigning numbers to aspects of performances, and then reasoning supported by statistical models. Some assessments employ measurement, others don't. Many tests do, at some level at least. I'm even going to distinguish two senses of measurement because the implications move in opposite directions. The classical sense is this historical view of taking scores as indicators of the same existing measurable cognitive attributes of persons in much the sense that we measure length or mass. A pragmatic sense, on the other hand, is intended to support reasoning through patterns in situated performances of individuals in contact with respect to what is known and not known about them for contextualized inferences and uses, notably including learning. So first, implications for assessment. We now have a coherent way to think through all the different kinds of assessments. We don't need to see different kinds of assessments as bound to conflicting views of students' capabilities and learning. This framing opens us to a space of forms of assessment, each with their own advantages and disadvantages, uses and misuses, degree of contextualization, constraints, feedback they can provide to individuals and systems. We can use assessments then of different types for different situations and uses, but still all grounded in this same view of learning in an area, and use the argumentation frame to analyze what they can and can't do and their qualities in doing it, and how they work well and how they don't work as well in different situations for different purposes for different individuals. This framing in particular brings out ways that measurement models alone aren't built to, and that is this role of context and students' background, and the consequences of what is lost for learning purposes when you don't have that. So turn to implications for testing. Even with constraints on contextualization, technology opens the door to a much wider array of assessment activities. Interactive tasks, collaborations, complex performances, inferences over time. More informative feedback by means either automated or for students themselves to flesh out as integral to their learning. And in contextualizing by creating, adapting, or populating tasks to better match individuals to them at the time and the place for the purpose. So the big payoff for learning is not in tasks per se, but in this contextualization. The matchups of students' histories of experience, what they already know and can do, and what kinds of situations, and integration with learning opportunities. Implications for measurement. Well, carrying out educational assessment from a sociocognitive perspective, there's decreasing value in that historical objective of classical measurement. The notion of measuring in the same way for everybody, existing cognitive attributes that are considered to be the same in essence for everybody. This way of thinking of people's capabilities limits how one can support furthering them. On the other hand, there's increasing value for analytic tools that pragmatically support situated reasoning through those argumentation structures. This is numbers and models, not for characterizing and categorizing people, but for working with evidence. We can still use them to improve the quality of information in assessments and the validity and the fairness of their use. Sometimes familiar models and analytic methods will continue to be useful, but as reconceived. Others can be extended to new forms and uses of assessment, and other new methodologies are developing as technologies continue to progress. So here's some takeaways. We can see assessment not primarily in terms of measurement per se, but in terms of evidentiary argument, situated in social context, shaped by purposes, attuned to learning goals, how people learn, what we know about students, and what they know about themselves. We can see not different assessments as different conflicting views of students, domains, and learning, but assessments taking different forms in an ever-expanding design space, all with their own advantages and disadvantages, interpretations that they do and do not support, and how they mesh with the purposes and the students they are meant to serve. We circle back to the beginning then, and Elsa and Ed. Attunement to a student is the key to the value that an assessment event has for that student's learning. Timing, language, prior learning, interest, goals, history of experience. So I'd like to end by saying thank you to everybody who's joining us today, and to Professor Edmund Gordon, whose tireless scholarship and advocacy to improve learning and assessment have brought us together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob. That was marvelous. I particularly loved your socio-cognitive perspective, the idea of evidentiary argumentation situated in the learning context, taking into account the children and the learners. That's very important for us to remember. Now we go to data analytics and data science. What a nice transition. Ryan Baker is going to take us away with his talk now. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and it's a great honor to be part of this. I'll be talking about work on from algorithmic bias to fair automated algorithms in education. This work is in collaboration with Aaron Hahn, a recent graduate from TC. So the use of automated algorithms is increasing in education, a lot of applications. Whether a learner's mastered a skill in interactive homework, whether a learner is developing computational thinking skills in a game, whether a child is mind wandering while watching a video, which learners are at risk of dropping out of high school, whether an essay demonstrates English language competency, and many other examples. Next. The use of these algorithms has led to better outcomes for many students, including things like improved learning outcomes, lower dropout, and enriched learning experiences. Next. And it's worth talking about, where do these algorithms come from? They're effective in general, but are they effective for everybody? So there's this, cycle from, where there's some task, there's measurement and data, there's a model of what's going on, learning of that model, machine learning, not human learning here. And then we develop a model of the thing we want to model, and we deploy it, we see how it works in the actual world, and that changes, and there's a cycle that goes round and round. But there's increased concerns that these algorithms are biased, that they're unequally effective or produce unequal results for people from different backgrounds. Next. There's a lot of definitions of algorithmic bias. One definition is that biased computer systems systematically and unfairly discriminate against individuals or groups of individuals in favor of others. Another definition taken from my recent article with Aaron Hahn is that we can look just narrowly at cases where an algorithm just does substantially better or worse for different groups of learners. In doing this, and I'll talk about, the first step is that we have unknown bias. We don't actually know how or where the algorithms might be failing. We have a sense of who might be affected, maybe from kind of reports in other areas of algorithms, or from just what we know about systemic inequities in society, but we don't actually know how it's playing out in algorithms. We can move from that to known bias, where we start to know what's going wrong, From there, we can work towards fixing those problems, move towards fairness, and finally towards creating equity. Next. A key problem that we see a lot is convenience sampling. A lot of times when people build these models, they just take whoever they can easily get at hand. And then the model performs less well for groups that are less well represented in the data used to develop the model. It should be obvious by 2021, but it doesn't seem to be, that, for example, suburban middle-class students are not the same as urban lower-income students. The students of different races are not identical. And yet we still see people developing machine learned models on populations that are overwhelmingly the students who are easiest to study and closest by to hand. Some people will say then, oh, we'll just fix that by including everybody in our sample, everybody in the data, the universe we're interested in. But even a sort of, so to speak, complete data set may not be enough if a group is rarely seen in the data set. My colleague Henry Anderson shows an example where they took everybody in a university and studied dropout among these learners and tried to predict that, but there were so few students of Native American / First Nation background in the sample that it just wasn't possible to make a valid model for those learners. Next. So what do we know about bias that impacts learners in common demographic categories? Well, in one report by Holstein and colleagues, folks in industry trying to develop these models often struggled to anticipate which subpopulations and forms of unfairness they needed to consider for specific machine learning applications. Luc Paquette and colleagues showed in a recent report in the Journal of Educational Data Mining that most research on algorithms in education don't even mention learner demographics, much less investigate impacts, differential impacts for learners in different demographic groups. So there's some biases that are relatively well documented. And by relatively well documented, I mean poorly, but more than nothing. There's been a small number of papers demonstrating algorithmic bias in terms of race and ethnicity, particularly in context of predicting who will drop out of college or high school. There's been a little bit of work on national origin. In this case, more idiosyncratically on who's done the research and what they were looking at. But there's been work on this in linguistic algorithms for education and studying how people use help systems in education. There's been some work on gender across a few contexts. Even in these groups, there's really been insufficient research. We know that these groups are being affected, but we don't really know the full span of context where they're being affected. And do we even know about all the groups that are impacted? There's been, say, 1 study on second language learners, 2 studies on learners with disabilities. They didn't even really go into depth about what kind of disabilities. 2 studies comparing urban, rural, suburban differences between learners. 2 totally different domains. In one domain, it made a big difference. In the other, it didn't. 2 studies on parental educational background. 2 studies on socioeconomic status. 1 study on children in military families. Many differences, many groups haven't even been studied at all. And let's not even start thinking about intersectionality. That just hasn't been looked at. There's been so little work so far. So if we want to go down this path from unknown bias to known bias to fairness to equity, we have a lot of work to do. I want to talk about a few key obstacles to overcoming bias. One of them is lack of data on group membership. A lot of data sets, people collect these voluminous data sets and they have all the interaction a student did, or they have all the courses a student took, and yet they don't have any data on demographics. And how do we get here? One answer is privacy risks. People are really worried about student privacy. Student privacy is important, but not thinking carefully about balancing privacy versus algorithmic bias means that we can't figure out if it's happening. Regulatory, legal IRB restrictions. It's a lot easier to get IRB approval for studies if you just simply throw out everything identifiable about a learner, including things that maybe actually aren't all that identifiable. But if you just kind of go to the far extreme throughout everything, you get through the IRB much quicker. Lack of transparency on bias and group-specific outcomes. How do we get here? Well, there's, again, strong commercial incentives against transparency and against group data collection. If you release data for other people to inspect, you get accused of violating privacy. If you collect data on group membership, people raise concerns. There's also out there universalist models of effectiveness, like the What Works Clearinghouse and evidence for ESSA. These these clearinghouses try to collect the evidence on what's effective, but not on what's effective where and for who. They will generally treat it as a curriculum has been demonstrate evidence for effective or not effective. And a lot of curricula will work in some places and not in others. So where do we go from here? One key step, improve data collection. Collect data on group membership. A lot of, whatever variables you can feasibly get, keeping in mind the need for privacy, and I'll talk about that in a second, how we can maintain privacy better. I don't yet have enough evidence to really make broad recommendations about what categories beyond some of what I've talked about earlier, but we need to collect that evidence, and then we need to collect the data. Encourage regulators, IRBs, other privacy officers to balance the risk of privacy violations with the risks of missing out on algorithmic bias. There are also potential ways to reduce privacy risks while still being able to use fuller information. I'm not actually suggesting that we hand out students names and zip codes and social security numbers to anybody who wants them. There are things we can do, like data obfuscation, where categories that are sufficiently rare that we could identify students, we kind of merge until we have a big enough set of categories. But categories that are bigger in number in the data, we kind of leave the information in there because we can't identify given students. Work by folks like Gardner and others to make it so people can analyze data but not view it. So, secured data enclaves where you can put in an analysis and you can get at information on the results of your analysis, but you can't actually see the data you're doing it on in terms of these variables. And legal agreements before access, like the Assessments Project, which requires anyone analyzing their data to sign a legal agreement about how they'll use it first. We also can work on creating practices for making sure the training sets are representative. Beth Tipton, formerly of TC, has the Generalizer Project, which looks at how to if you have a set of certain variables, how to make sure your samples are representative across them. Through this, we can address underrepresentation of key groups. And part of this will be determining how much data is actually needed for subpopulations for these algorithms to work. Statisticians have power analysis. Machine learners and data miners largely still don't. We need to have methods like that so we can have a good way to know how much data is enough data to know that our algorithms are less likely to be biased. Finally, I think, facilitate and incentivize openness. Create guidelines for academic publication. Work with relevant scientific societies and journal editors to encourage this. The folks in this room, the folks hearing this, have a lot of influence, a lot of power to influence the people making these decisions. Also, push towards algorithmic bias review. Governmental agencies, when they demonstrate the effectiveness of new medicines these days, require algorithmic bias reviews. We should be doing the same in education. And finally, broaden the community. Data science is a notoriously non-diverse field, and data scientists like myself will be unsuccessful if we try to solve these problems on our own. Members of the communities being affected can always do a better job of advocating for their perspective than well-meaning outsiders, who often fail to fully understand the issues at hand or the constraints to a successful solution. As Holstein said, we need to take the humans who are building these algorithms, and we need to consider their biases and blind spots if we're to fix the biases and blind spots in the algorithms. By consulting community members throughout algorithmic development, not just at the end, we can expand efforts to broaden participation. And similarly, by expanding the tools, we can make it possible for a broader range of people to be involved in doing data science, even if they don't have a background in data science. So we can make the world better by going from unknown bias to known bias to fairness to equity. Thank you very much for your time and attention. We have a preprint on algorithmic bias in education. Go to Google Scholar, Baker Hahn, algorithmic bias in education. Thank you very much.
Hello, Ryan. My goodness, you're doing such important work here. You've pointed out both the promise and the challenges of all of these automated algorithms. Using the algorithms on the one hand might give us insights, but we need to improve the science in data science. We need to be able to sample in an intentional way to be able to produce algorithms that work and that are not biased. Thank you so much for that important perspective. Now, our third presenter is going to be Professor Richard Duran, who is going to speak to socio-cultural perspectives of assessment and learning. Thank you, Richard. The stage is yours.
Okay, thank you, Madhabi, and I'm very pleased to be here and join everyone in the celebration of the professor's 100 years contribution to life on Earth and all of us. And next slide, please. I'm going to be speaking about the concept of affirmative development in a way that challenges some of our notions of assessment and invites thinking about assessment in a way that is more utile with regard to thinking about affirmative development. What my views are complementary to other things that are being talked about. Alternative models and ways of viewing things are very essential and important to consider and adjudicate and reason about in order to be able to really take advantage of human potential. And affirmative development was introduced by Professor Gordon and colleagues to address not just immediate learning of content and mastery of skills, but further to deal with the social and policy and pedagogical dimensions of development of personhood in society and culture, given the kinds of circumstances and histories that underlie how people have related together with an unequal distribution of opportunities, and at the same time agency being very much alive in the communities that are underserved. And that appreciation of the assets and resources of community members who are underserved are a part of the kind of cultivation of experience that we all experience, whatever background we're from, but which can end up being blocked or obstructed by perspectives that block understanding the creative capabilities of people that have historically evolved in the human species. So his concerns have been about social justice and the capacities of people to work together to develop populations. And he's also been concerned with the issues of 21st century adaptive competencies across social cultural contexts. And next slide. What I'm going to be doing is discussing how this perspective has evolved from thinking about assessment in the service of learning and what it might mean to think about other ways of thinking about assessment that might not be assessment in the service of learning in the microgenetic sense, about learning skills and competencies that can be manipulated within the classrooms as garden plots, as Jim Greeno has talked about, where where you line up the rows and columns and you make variations and design experiments of things where you change things very carefully in order to understand the potential causes of changes in learning capacity associated with curriculum, instruction, and assessment. Not to say that those things aren't important, but also, as Jim Greeno has noted, there's value in understanding what's possible for the jungle to produce, and life is the jungle. And so, and this kind of orientation, as we'll be getting into, leads to rethinking of what deeper learning can mean, with attention to learners' collective self-actualization and agency to become. And yesterday we had some preview of those kinds of notions in thinking about how persons and communities think about possible futures and how they can align their experiences with schooling as an institution so that it resonates with the ontologies or worldviews of people who are trying to survive under adverse circumstances, but also trying to use schooling as a resource for development. Next slide. So I'm going to start by focusing on some simple thoughts on what does do typical assessment situations look like to students. And I'm not trying to cover everything, but I want us to think about what it means to try to figure out, if you're a student and you're going into a large scale assessment or classroom assessment, what are you experiencing? I mean, there's the perspective of the assessment designers, the schooling system policymakers, on what you're trying to do and learn to be able to support students' acquisition and proficiency and skills and knowledge that are tied to thinking about futures. And we heard Linda Darling-Hammond yesterday remind us of the origins of the factory model and at the turn the beginning of the 20th century, and how that created a mindset that then permeated the schooling institutions and the concern for having students go through school systems and acquire the knowledge and skills that are important for functioning economy and social order, given the emphasis on the proficiencies that are needed to do things that are of value to supporting the economy. And that's only part of the story. And so we're going to talk about the Fulker psychology is a bit. So it's a typical context of large-scale assessments. Kids encounter these at towards the end of the school year currently, and they're tied to standards and goals and policies associated. And then students encounter these assessments. So the assessment events are they're embedded in the lives of the kids. They're going through them and they're experiencing as, how do we get closer to lunch, or when is this over? But I can do this, or I can't do this, or this is frustrating. So the student perspective is different than the perspective of the assessment designer and teachers and persons who are using those assessments to gauge student capabilities. Interim assessments are seemingly can be aligned with large-scale assessments and capture students' ability and experiences along the way to becoming proficient in skills in a way that says this assessment event to the kids is saying, well, this is something like I'm being taught, but how does it connect? That's a variable, of course, to be able to make those connections. Other kinds of assessments, so just largely labeling here is classroom assessments that are more teacher design or designed by commercial entities trying to support teaching and teachers' materials, can be tied to instruction, but they have a similar sort. They may or may not connect directly with students' experiences in learning and offer them feedback in terms of developing proficiency. I point out proximal formative assessments and think here of the work of Margaret Heritage as an example, where assessments are embedded in instruction involving performance, feedback, and students' social and self-regulation with guidance from a teacher and instruction to help guide students to be able to master target skills. Now, one interesting side property here, it's not a side property, it's central. And that's kind of like when you get to that center, then it can change how we might think about assessments, is the presence of dialogic engagement of students with each other that supports their performance and ability to get to the point and to succeed in completing tasks, and hopefully with acquisition of the skills, at least experience, and then later worrying about the generalization. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to dare say there is a fundamental kind of assessment that all humans and biological creatures do, is that they figure out what the heck is going on around them. So the wild is happening in the classroom while students are taking assessments. It's happening everywhere all the time. So think of life as a theater, and with a constant, and people who pursued cognitive research on theory of mind kind of laid a foundation for thinking about that in terms of scientific terms, but it happens without the theory of mind. It happens naturally and biologically and in terms of how culture operates. To think of life as a theater that's constantly creating opportunities for people in situations, including classroom situations, assessment situations, to think about what are they doing? Basic questions that all reading teachers engage in, and that if you read the National Council of Teachers of Education or ILA literature, you see. The kids are in theater. They're as they're going through their classroom experience and activities, to give them a chance, they raise possibilities about how what they're doing is related to things that are of value to them, and it's very challenging to think about how academic tasks themselves that involve assessments that can be embedded or that where students are thinking about performing to standard, how they can connect what they're being asked to do with what they can do when they talk to each other. So interesting possibilities arise regarding stimulating student engagement and affirmative development related to becoming. And here the fancy term prolepsis. Read Mike Cole's book on cultural psychology, an example of thinking about futures and about the importance of that in terms of thinking about development of personhood. And so what I'm going to do is to show you an example of results I had from a study that examines how this can happen, why it's important to worry about if we're thinking about affirmative development. So next slide, please. So I'm going to talk with you a little bit about an example of a study I carried out way back in third grade kids from Latinx backgrounds in our community, where they were, and these are Latino immigrant kids, and where they're asked to read a story about a bear called Grizzle who had issues because he was big and he encountered, or it encountered, complaints from other beings, from people about being too big and getting in the way. And so kids were asked to read this story about Grizzle's grumble. And what they did was they read half of the start of the story, and then using something like a reciprocal teaching technique, where students were asked to predict what happens in the next part of the story. And then, you go back, ask the kids who are working in groups with teacher guidance, show me in the text what happened to Grizzle, and how did your predictions fail or not, thereby helping develop their microgenetic capabilities and analyzing correspondence between beliefs about how predictions might work with what actually ensues. So it's kind of like a critical thinking skill and literacy. And so we had kids do this, and in a study that we carried out, and what we discovered was kids going off topics to explore how the story brought up projections that they had about who, what, when, where, and how. Where they were exploring their possible futures, because that was what was important to them. What was important to them wasn't just doing what the teacher wanted and what they were being held accountable for, but what was more important was for them to relate to each other and to explore how meaning happens and what happens in situations when people are given the chance to express themselves. So what were the students thinking about? So next slide, please. Okay, so this is a transcript with some fancy conversation analysis kind of coding in it, where three students talk about when they encountered the word big in that first part of that story, what were they thinking about that was inviting to them about thinking about what they wanted to talk about. So what they were doing, they were in effect assessing the situation they were in, okay, a different meaning for assessing, and they were trying to make something from it. They were taking the occasion to be able to cultivate their ways about thinking about their future. So Leticia says, if I were big like Grizzle, but she, third grader, took the word big and saying that I would be old, and what would that mean? And, it's like Leticia talking about herself, although the story was about Grizzle. Leticia says, I could clean house for her. I could do anything in the house. And I could take her to New York. This is her mother, and other places. And Vanessa says, okay, acknowledging receipt of that. And then Leticia says, I could buy a house for me, my family, and I could. And then Graciela says, she's going to be rich. That little exchange is really interesting, deep learning. They're taking this occasion to make sense of their futures. They're taking what was a topic at hand, an assignment, and transforming it into work that they could do together to think about who they are and what's involved in being a person and thinking ahead about futures and what it means to be thinking about these kinds of concepts, not just in the context of the story, but in the context of their lives, and making this opportunity to be together be an opportunity about how to think about the future and how to think about social relations. And this requires, as you're saying, kind of a sense of values, socioeconomic setting, concern for family. So, Letitia's not just thinking about herself, she's thinking about her mother. So the ontology, the values that, like we heard about yesterday in afternoon in Kwanzaa, and the perspectives of community members who are coming from aggrieved backgrounds, who are not being served properly, have beliefs that are foundational to their thinking about things. And these are transmitted to their kids, and the kids are thinking about their futures. So next slide. Okay. Then as this conversation continues that I've cited, the kids then go on further to explore the meaning of their futures, the who, what, when, where, and how possible worlds that they might live in, and the cultural models that are associated with it, and the situations that they might encounter. So then Leticia interjects that if in context, what she was saying is that she could become a policeman, and Vanessa politically corrects her. Now the gender-oriented language, police girl. Okay, the concern for equity in language and how it reflects roles and the importance of acknowledging those things. So those kinds of perceptions, these are spontaneously coming up among the students in this activity that was not about this, but this is what they wanted it to be. And then Leticia adds on further, and maybe a teacher, another possible role in the future for her mother in New York. Okay, and then also the issue comes up. Leticia also is as an alternative teacher. She first said being a police girl, okay, and then Graciela says, "I don't want to be a cop. They'll fight you." So these topics bring up social analysis of what's going on, what it means to be a person in social roles, and then how important that is to worry about in this space that was tied to another task. It was an important kind of microgenic task, but this was an opportunity to explore identity. So next slide. Okay, so what this raises, is there's social justice implications tied to affirmative development if we're going to build it into more fully into our opportunities in classrooms, and flexibility of academic tasks to allow students to learn how to address what's the specific learning goals that are targeted by teachers, can end up being hijacked by students productively. And the hijacking can serve prolepsis, serving equity and social justice goals. So, as many people in the language arts community, and when we look now at the debates about the new NAEP reading description and how to build in social cultural perspectives into it. Right now there's a lot of active exploring about thinking how kids make meaning in classrooms and lessons, and the issues that are arising. How can we marry these two ends in very different notions of assessment happening together? And so I know I've distorted assessment altogether, but I've done it deliberately because I wanted to kind of draw attention to the very primitive, by primitive and basic foundational ways that people interpret experiences as theater and possible worlds and ontologies, and build that in to thinking about how do we worry about how to bring assessments and tasks together into a better alignment with the notions of affirmative development. So next slide and we'll finish. Okay, so here is the professor in 2001 and before. And how we deal with these issues of affirmative development is a very complex matter, has many dimensions, and we're indebted to the professor for helping bring these issues to the fore in terms of our research and in terms of the ways we can guide practice. And as we proceed in thinking these things through, the things that are going on right now with technology, where identity texts are being produced by people, by kids, on apps, TikTok and other things, and text messages. There's just so much intellectual chatter and world envisionments going on. We ought to give consideration to what's going on here and how we might be able to build these kinds of resources better into our curriculum and think about how they might augment our notions of assessment. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was quite provocative in parts. Particularly, I liked your idea of not making all learners work in lockstep towards competency acquisition and look for the light in the jungle. I love that, because often it is when learners are grappling with difficult learning tasks that we gain insights into what they need and how they learn. I also related to your idea of proximal embedded formative assessments, and you know why I did some work myself in that area. I also liked your anecdotal assessment, assessments that help self-actualize one's potential is really something we should all try to aspire towards. So I just want to give a shout out to everybody out in the audience. Please add your questions and please add your comments for our wonderful speakers. Thank you, Richard. I'm going to now move to our next speaker, Professor Neil Kingston from the University of Kansas. Thank you.
Thank you. I had the privilege of taking an assessment course from Ed Gordon at Teachers College 45 years ago. Though unfortunately I have not had the opportunity to work with Ed since then, his work has nonetheless impacted my career and the large-scale and classroom assessment programs for which I've been part of the design team. For example, my colleagues and I have designed several testing programs that are instructionally embedded and instructionally relevant. We strongly believe the assessment of educational achievement must have as its primary purpose the improvement of student learning. Today, I will share a few stories and share one small idea to help some tests better serve this purpose by reducing one barrier. I will start with a song lyric and a meme. In 1995, Coolio released the album and the song Gangsta's Paradise, which contained this lyric expressing a pervasive problem in education broadly, but perhaps even more so in testing. They say I gotta learn, but nobody's here to teach me. If they can't understand it, how can they reach me? I will come back to the importance of student engagement later. In 2012, Craig Frohl posted on Google Plus a meme that he had created. Over the last 9 years, many variants appeared, including this one, in which the first two pictures were labeled equality and equity. And later a third picture was added, which has had many different labels, but I will call it accessibility. The point of the meme is that equal is not necessarily fair nor appropriate. However, the history of improvement of assessment has been driven by standardization, the implementation of equal content, equal administration conditions, and equal scoring. Herein, I will argue that standardization in testing is not necessarily fair nor appropriate and can interfere with our understanding of what students know and can do, and how teachers can optimally help them learn. The history of standardized testing in the United States started with Horace Mann, who in 1845 was concerned that the tests of his era were like a race, where one person runs on a paved level path and another runs up a muddy hill. At that time, examinations were oral, with each student responding to different questions. Mann's proposal to standardize testing by having everyone respond to the same essays was well-intentioned and initially had many positive outcomes. A next major step in standardization for assessment was the invention and popularization of the selected response item type, which added scoring to the aspects of testing that could be standardized. Frederick J. Kelly's 1914 dissertation at Teachers College was titled Teachers' Marks, Their Variability and Standardization. In 1915, Kelly returned to Kansas, serving as training director at the Kansas State Normal School, where he wrote the first large-scale assessment with selected response items, the Kansas Silent Reading Test, in 1915. Here are 2 items from the test form used for students in grades 3 through 5. It is worth noting how different these items are from any item that would be found on a contemporary reading test. The silent reading is only of a question, not a reading passage. A correct response requires knowledge external to the test. If you had never seen an orange, you would be at a disadvantage. The Army Alpha was introduced in 1917 and administered to more than 1 million recruits. The data showed large average differences among the scores of native-born white examinees, immigrant white examinees, and black examinees. Other aspects of the data illuminated by Ashley Montague in 1945 raised questions about possible socioeconomic reasons for these differences. For example, the average score of northern black recruits was higher than the average score of southern white recruits, and the differences between average scores of black and white recruits were almost twice as large in southern states as in northern states. Other research studies have looked for specific cultural and linguistic factors that affect test scores. For example, Medley and Quirk created multiple forms of general education items in the National Teacher Examinations, the predecessor of Praxis. One form had items that focused on classical cultural knowledge, one form on contemporary culture, and one on black culture. Black examinees did relatively better on the forms that focused on contemporary culture and black culture compared to classical culture. Choices in test design impact relative performance. As another example, Alicia Schmidt documented that Hispanic students in the United States did relatively better on SAT verbal items that contained words that shared common roots in Spanish and English, or that contained content of special interest to Hispanic students. Over time, measurement researchers and test makers started investigating concerns of test bias, and by the 1960s started scrutinizing potential bias at the item level. By 1980, regular analyses of items for differential performance between reference and focal groups were being performed. To do this, on a large scale, efficient methods of differential item functioning analysis were developed, the 2 most common used being the Mantle-Hansel statistic and logistic regression. When I worked on the GRE biology test around 1983, we noted that most cellular and molecular biology items that showed diff tended to favor males, and most organismal biology and ecology items that showed diff tended to favor females. Review of course-taking patterns and intended graduate program specialization showed that males at that time took many more undergraduate courses in cellular and molecular biology than did females. Perhaps the bigger question is whether it was fair to judge an organismal biology major by her knowledge of molecular biology. As the history of testing progressed into the 20th century, developers of large-scale assessments realized that test specifications should be balanced on certain criteria. I first came across this circa 1976 when I discovered a counterexample. I took an assessment course at Teachers College with Elizabeth Hagen, and for the final assignment, reviewed the SAT. I still remember noting in my review that in the sample test provided by the publisher, the number of items that used the name of a male character was about twice the number of items using the name of a female character. 2 years later, when I started working as a psychometrician on the Graduate Record Examinations program, I discovered that the test specifications ensured that the subject matter of reading comprehension passages was distributed among 3 different subject areas: humanities, social sciences including business, and natural sciences. Balance was being sought. Balance can serve several purposes. If certain groups have a small advantage from one context, then balance will allow those advantages to average out, preventing any bias from accruing in a single direction, with the hope that the results would then be fair to all test takers. In 1993, while I was Associate Commissioner of Education in Kentucky, some parents complained that the state assessment was scores based on constructed response items and problem solving was highly inaccurate because their child's score was not what they expected. Some quick research showed that many of these parents were right. A look at their children's test papers showed the students had produced no responses, half-hearted responses, or scatological responses. These students had chosen not to engage as intended with the test. Some years later, when I was vice president and measured progress, the state of New Hampshire faced similar concerns regarding engagement. We created an index of student engagement based on student response patterns. For example, a student might have chosen A for every response option, or filled in the answer sheet with a zigzag of bubbles, or my favorite, filled in the bubbles to suggest a Christmas tree. These patterns were uncommon for elementary school children, maybe 1 to 2% of students, but more common for middle school students, 3 to 5%, and around 10% for high school students, a significant number. Later in Kansas, we were developing the dynamic learning maps alternate assessment for students with significant cognitive disabilities. Many of the mathematics items required physical manipulatives to make the content accessible. We were considering creating a kit of standard manipulatives that schools could purchase if they did not want to gather materials themselves. Before moving the idea forward, we met with teachers to gather feedback. We were discussing the use of counting beads when a teacher described one of her students who was on the autism spectrum. This student was fascinated by doorknobs, but would usually not attend to other objects in a classroom setting. If objects were to be counted or grouped, this student would be able to demonstrate knowledge only if the objects were doorknobs. Different students who were similarly impacted by autism might have different objects that would optimize their ability to demonstrate their knowledge. Switching gears a little bit, a common approach to automated item generation is as follows. Item models or templates are created, perhaps by inspecting existing high-quality items, and are written in terms of variables for which values can be chosen to create a very large number of items with very similar item difficulty and discrimination statistics. Research on this has been going on for 30 or more years. In 2018, Susan Embertson and I provided an example of a base item and 2 structural variants, the first more difficult than the base item because it contained extraneous information, and the second made easier because it reduced a 2-step problem to a 1-step problem. They then created templates from the base item and the 2 structural variants. Item difficulty and discrimination parameters were predicted from the item generating template and variant. The authors found a parameter of a family and structure, the A parameters of family and structural variants could be predicted with a correlation of 0.91, and the B parameters could be predicted with a correlation of 0.93 for family variants and 0.96 for structural variants. This is just a bit lower than the correlations of those item parameters if they were calculated based on 2 non-random samples. To date, automatic item generation has been used to create new items that can be used interchangeably for all examinees. Perhaps as an alternative, AIG could be used to support personalization that enhances accessibility and engagement. My colleagues and I proposed a similar idea as part of our 2010 Dynamic Learning Maps proposal, because student engagement was known to be a considerable issue for students with significant cognitive disabilities. Funding and time did not allow us to pursue that path. Perhaps we should do so now. If one wanted to implement such a system, the same templates could be used for all students, but the values of the variables could be chosen to engage each individual student rather than at random. Before a test, we could gather information about each student and use that information at the time of test administration to personalize the test to maximize relatability, interest, and engagement. There are at least 2 levels of personalization that could be explored: group and individual. At the group level, a student could be asked if they prefer contextualization of items in terms of group variables, including culture, ethnicity, and region. Of course, the identity of some items would still be driven by curriculum. A social studies item about the impact of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X would still be about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. But an item about the price of 7 pounds of apples could talk about Sarah or Sam or weigh or WAN without affecting either curricular relevance or predicted difficulty of the item. We could go beyond customizing by group identity to personalizing to the individual. In the template example showed earlier, if we ask students what their favorite fruit is, we could use that in the item. We could match the names in some items to the names of best friends or favorite relatives. An item could refer to the name of the street, of the school, or the child's home. A sport or game could provide context, could be the sport or game that that child identified as of interest. Now we are equalizing engagement. No longer is everyone given the same box to stand on to watch the game. Perhaps we get to go past the simplistic approach of just focusing on the number of boxes appropriate for a child's height. Without equalizing engagement, how can a test be a fair measure of what a child knows and can do? I hereby argue the predicted difficulty is more appropriate than the observed difficulty in a group of examinees who do not share the same level of engagement. While I have laid out these considerations in the context of large-scale assessments, they are as or more important for formative assessments. If students are not engaged, or if there are cultural or language impediments to students demonstrating their knowledge, the teacher will not understand what the children know or what is impeding the development of deeper or broader understandings. Those students will fall behind. While formative assessment is a process, not a type of test, there are tests that are often used in the formative assessment process. Teaching is a complex, time-consuming job, and even the very best teachers need tools to help them. Moreover, these same concepts can, and often have been, be used by teachers in oral formative practice. Of course, there are many issues, potential issues, with the use of AIG as a tool for de-standardizing assessment, but let us start that research now. Thank you all for listening, and thank you, Dr. Gordon, for a lifetime of inspiration.
Thank you, Neil. Another provocative presentation. And yes, it is. We need to move towards destandardization if we are to reach the kinds of kids that Coolio was referring to. If you don't understand me, how can you teach me? How can I learn? That's fundamentally the question. So I thought what interested me the most is that you gave the example of the case with autism, and the child couldn't demonstrate the learning until the task was adapted to the child's frame of reference. And that's exactly what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. So thank you for your recommendations. I hope people are paying attention and raising questions, and I hope the comment box is going to be full. I will move to the next presenter, Professor Eva Baker. Professor Baker, the stage is yours. I'm looking forward to what you're going to say.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I want to start with a couple of comments. Number one, as I suspected, all of the prior speakers considered ideas that contribute to my thinking and that I'm discussing today. So I want to thank them for doing what I needed without knowing that what my presentation was about. Secondly, I want to thank Professor Gordon for his intellectual leadership, his mentoring, and his kindness, although I'd like to point out that his enormous fund of kindness does not get in the way of his demands for clarity and quality. Next slide, please. I've been continuing my learning with Professor Gordon as a participant in a seminar organized by him, including some of the people on this panel, but a large number of individuals from very different academic and practice environments. And my comments today grow directly from the seminar, but clearly they reflect my own interpretation of unfinished business, some of which points are listed on this slide. But they're my interpretation, and blame no one else for what I say. Let me start by saying now that I know we have been here before. I think we have been here before, even at Teachers College, considering how to make assessments more useful and relevant to both children and their teachers, and then to the more distal groups that want to know what's going on. Depending on how you count, contention around this issue, as opposed to other kinds of testing that Neil described, for example, it's been going on at least 70 years. I believe right now that we can restart our in earnest, because there is new understanding of student experiences, as Richard pointed out, and there are greater appreciations of where our students should be able to go. So I think there is new hope of a more organic approach to assessment and learning, one that propels learners' growth without toxic side effects. Various efforts have been made, as we all know, to monitor the progress of underperforming schools and children who attend them, including disaggregating results and broadening and trying to make more relevant the assessments for students and usable for teachers, to link more closely learning with assessments. These good ideas have failed for at least two reasons. One, because the assessments have been inadequate and the message of their benefit could not contend with the combined power of commercial entities and the government. So instead, the scholarly community continued to do what we have been well practiced to do, and that is talking to ourselves. So I propose we give that up. And part of my point is that our message has to go to a broad and a diverse audience. We have to engage the deep belief systems of our own, as well as others, as well as the technical habits that support existing systems for learning, both inside and outside of formal schooling. We have to underscore what we mean by equity and think of it as not limited to scores, but to the wider opportunities assessments can open. Next slide, please. So it isn't easy to change or even modify what we think and what we do. We hold on to dysfunctional patterns of behavior. Familiar pain is safer than unfamiliar relief. So in some ways, tests and assessments that may neither reflect nor lead learning remain in place. It's kind of a Stockholm syndrome. We're risk averse, even when tradition works against our own best interests. And of course, we know that a tight grip allows us to keep holding on to what is ours. But it's clear these grasps must relax, and that's for everyone. Next slide, please. So while our seminar is focused in part on the development of principles to underline the futures of assessment, I've chosen not to get into that level of detail, but to just give a general sense of where we are now for some people and the direction in which we want to go. So I'm calling those paths, and they're listed here. I think they're self-evident self-explanatory, at least assessment is an obstacle, assessment that supports only limited beneficiaries, the idea of changing the narrowness of assessment to a more expansive view and to increase its flexibility. We're also looking, because of informal learning and in part the experience of the pandemic, to the shift between institutionally based assessment to assessment that is in support of individual goals. So the ones I haven't talked about, I'm going to consider briefly next. Next slide, please. So these are the four, from a standalone option to something that's more integral, mystery to transparency, pushing on the purposes, and the notion of acquisition to application. Next slide, please. My sense of all of these is that I don't know whether we're able to get to where we think we want to be without addressing each of these. These are not mutually exclusive, and they're, while sometimes parallel, they cross each other's boundaries from time to time. So let me start with the idea of standalone to integral. Assessment makes no sense, of course, without reference to learning. And it has stood apart from learning and instruction for many good reasons, to provide a sense of objectivity, to address a broader range than what might be taught in a particular classroom, to support a notion of fairness. And these arguments were made all the way back in the 1930s. But if assessments to have effects on learning processes as well as outcomes, we have to look at very closely, as the prior speakers have said, to at individuals and not just at groups. What that means is we have to figure out how to fly close to the nap of the earth to pick up the detail we want. We also have to figure out a way to design both learning and assessment to be integrated and not separate. That means we're not trying to align them post hoc, but we're trying to have them develop organically. We have to find, once again, or at least enunciate, what the critical center of such assessments would be. I guess for now, they're going to be the 22nd century skills, since we don't seem to have mastered them yet. Learning to learn, collaboration, problem solving, deep domain knowledge, communication, transferring, and applying. My sense is that we need to get specific about them, because the more abstract connection of assessment to learning, the less powerful are the inferences we can draw from our evidence. Next slide, please. So the mystery of testing to the outside world is undeniable. People don't know much about assessments. They see them, scores are generated, and people accept them as if they were truth. So I think a lot of the mysteries are dysfunctional and a little scary. Our challenge, I think, is to create assessments with clear expectations, bounded content, maybe in ontologies, useful ways to demonstrate learning processes and outcomes, and to report them in an understandable, meaningful way. The challenge is to move from secrecy to more openness. Now, certainly transparency is a continuum, and we could make the commitment to move even in the, as Ryan pointed out, in an area of algorithms where many outcomes, people can't really tell you how they got there. They can just tell you what they show. We need to get smart about how we make those explicit. Next slide. So for learning-based assessments to rise, we have to find a way to divert the pull of accountability, desirable or misbegotten from your viewpoint. And I believe it needs to be leveraged better for learning, because if there's a flat-out contest, accountability always wins. The only solution that makes sense to me is to use the same design rules for accountability, assessment for learning, and other common purposes of assessment. The differences should be in the way we sample and report across assessment purposes. This precept may be the hardest to sell because of our strong psychometric upbringing. Next slide. So this path from acquisition to application leads to the truth, at least from my perspective, that all kinds of knowledge is important, starting with acquisition of domain knowledge and moving through the familiar to unexpected applications or conditions or situations. If our students are our future, and they will be required to cope with vast and unforeseen change, then all of them need to be prepared to demonstrate that they can adapt to challenges and adopt them in part as their own goals. The next slide, please. So how do you end this? Because in some ways, many of the details of my remarks have been made by my colleagues on this panel. It seems to me that we need to talk about our message and engagement. I trust that the technical work is lined up or close to lined up to meet many of the needs that have been identified. Engagement cuts always. If these ideas have merit, then they will need to be shared so that others can understand and contribute to their realization. We need to prepare ourselves to give up what hasn't worked in favor of a new level of quality, something that's acknowledged as valuable by students, their parents, their teachers, and their communities. To end with a fabulous cliche, these paths that I've outlined are the ways to walk the walk. Better still, maybe to sprint toward the assessments that we need and that Professor Gordon's viewpoints have led us to. Thank you.
Thanks, Eva. Again, I mean, you are making us think in ways where we have to question ourselves. We ourselves have to shed our belief systems and our, clinging on to technical and operational habits. And many of our panelists today are saying that, but you brought it to light. If we have to move away from old ways of doing things, and that face that unmoored lostness so that we can find creative solutions. So thank you for your thinking. The goal is to propel individual learners towards growth, as you say, without toxic side effects for any of the learners or society. I'm completely with you on that. Thank you. We now turn to our distinguished discussant, Professor J Pellegrino. Thank you.
Thank you. And pardon my voice, folks. I'm a little froggy today. I will do my best to present my remarks today on this wonderful panel and discussion. So I want to begin by thanking the organizers of this celebration of Ed Gordon's life and his many contributions to educational practice and social policy. It is truly a wonderful event. And as we heard yesterday and today, Ed continues to serve as an advocate and spokesperson for equity in education and for the design of environments that maximize human development and human potential. I am truly honored to be a part of this celebration and to offer some thoughts on the topic of today's session and the wonderful papers and presentations by my colleagues and friends, Bob and Ryan and Richard and Neil and Eva. Much of what I have to say about educational assessment reflects the influence of two very important mentors in my professional life, Bob Glazer and Ed Gordon. Bob's mentorship was in the first decade of my professional career, and it was at the University of Pittsburgh at the Learning, Research, and Development Center. As many of you know, Bob Glazer was a major advocate for educative assessment. He wrote compellingly about the role that assessment could and should play in the optimization of student learning. And as I said, I was fortunate to work with him at the Learning, Research, and Development Center at the University of Pittsburgh early in my career. Like Ed Gordon, he believed that advances in psychological theory and research on learning and knowing could transform educational assessment and make it more instructionally informative. I know that Bob and Ed shared much admiration for each other's efforts to promote educative assessment. And while Bob is no longer with us, it's important to note that he too would have turned 100 this year. So we can say with certainty that 1921 was truly a very significant year for the future of educational assessment. Now, Ed Gordon's influence on my research and thinking took hold most significantly when he asked me to serve as co-chair of the Gordon Commission. It was both an honor and a privilege to work with Ed in fostering the Commission's work. I learned much from him in that effort, and my learning from Ed has grown significant over the last decade as he has continued to challenge me about my thinking and my ideas. It was in the work of the Gordon Commission that many streams of thought began to come together to help frame a path forward for assessment. The Gordon Commission on the Future of Assessment in Education was created to consider the nature and content of American education during the 21st century and how assessment could be used most effectively to advance that vision by serving the educational and informational needs of students, teachers, and society. To do so, it was argued that assessments must fully represent the competencies that the increasingly complex and changing world demands. The best assessments can accelerate the acquisition of these competencies if they guide the actions of teachers and enable students to engage their progress. Thus, the tasks and activities must be models worthy of the attention and energy of teachers and students. The Commission called on policymakers at all levels to actively promote this much-needed transformation in assessment practice. Today's discussion builds upon that work and the thinking that has ensued by Ed and others in the years since the publication of the Gordon Commission reports. Yesterday, we heard Linda Darling-Hammond quote from Ed's 2020 paper in Educational Measurement Issues in Practice, the paper that he entitled Assessment in the Service of Learning. In that paper, Ed amplified the argument made by the Gordon Commission that investment needs to be made in assessment resources, tools, and practices that better integrate assessment with classroom teaching and learning, and that simultaneously better represent current thinking about how students learn and changes in the world at large. The globalization of the economy, advances in technology, development of the internet, and explosion of social media and other communications really do change the nature of what it means to be well-educated and competent in the 21st century. Digital technologies have empowered individuals in multiple ways, enabling them to express themselves, gather information easily, make informed choices, and organize themselves into networks for various purposes. New assessments, both external and internal to the classroom use, must fit squarely into this landscape of the future signaling what is important and helping learners know they are making progress toward productive citizenry. More specifically, assessments must advance competencies that are matched to the era in which we live, helping individuals to make sense of the world and how to operate effectively within it. Finally, assessments must do more than document what students are capable of and what they know. As argued by Ed, to be as useful as possible, assessments should provide clues as to why students think the way they do, how they are learning, as well as any reasons for any misunderstandings or gaps in knowledge and skills that may have developed along the way. As noted by Linda yesterday, Ed's EMIT paper provided us with an array of approaches and examples of assessment that are oriented towards the formative development of student competence. All of the examples suggest that we can create context and tools for assessment that are very different from much of assessment as we have come to know it over the last 100 plus years, extending back to the time of Binet, Spearman, and Terman. Today's session is entitled towards Next Generation Affirmative and Formative Assessments for Learning and in the Service of Learning. All 5 presentations that you've heard are very much aligned with the goal of providing insights into how we can move towards a future of assessment that embodies what Ed Gordon has exhorted us to do. In the time available, I cannot do justice to all that my colleagues have offered in the way of ideas and directions, but let us consider some key ideas and cross-cutting themes that align with the goals and purposes of assessment as articulated by Ed in his ongoing effort to promote the design and practice of educative and humane assessment. There are 4 topics I want to briefly address. The first topic is that of assessment as a process of reasoning from evidence. The second topic is the significance of a sociocultural framing of knowing, learning, and performance. The third is about fairness, equity, and standardization. And the fourth is about validity. Over 20 years ago, Bob Mislevy, Eva Baker, Bob Glazer, and I were members of the National Research Council Committee on the Foundations of Assessment. Together with several other scholars, we produced a report. Some of you have heard of it. It was called Knowing What Students Know, the Science and Design of Educational Assessment. We argued in that report that all assessment is a process of reasoning from evidence to support inferences about what students know and can do. This process of reasoning from evidence was portrayed as a triad of 3 interconnected elements, what came to be called the assessment triangle. The vertices of the assessment triangle represent the 3 key elements underlying any assessment process. The first is a model of student knowing and learning in the domain of the assessment. The second is a set of assumptions and principles about the kinds of observations that will provide evidence of students' competencies relative to the underlying conceptual model of knowing and learning. And the third is an interpretation process for making sense of the evidence in light of the assessment purpose and intended use. The 3 are represented as vertices of a triangle because each is connected to and dependent on the other 2. A major tenet of Knowing What Students Know report is that for an assessment to be effective and valid, the 3 elements must be in synchrony given its intended purpose and interpretive use. Bob Mislevy has reminded us today of the significance of this framing of assessment. It holds regardless of the context or form that the assessment may take or its intended purpose and use. The presentations by Ryan, Richard, Neil, and Eva each speak to one or more of the elements of this reasoning process and their interrelationships, whether it be the types of observations we choose to make and the interpretive schemes we apply to them, or the very processes of using inferential tools and methods, such as measurement models or artificial intelligence, to help us extract meaning from the observations given some interpretive context. This brings me to the second important theme found in these presentations and emphasized most clearly in Bob's and Richard's papers. What we reason about and toward, and the quality of the inferences we can draw about what students know and can do, is very much driven by how we conceptualize knowing and learning. What it means to know and how learning is transacted is critical to the entire process. As pointed out by both Bob and Richard, A contemporary sociocultural framing has dramatic implications for how we understand the limitations of much of conventional assessment practice as we have known it, as well as how we should conceive of assessment going forward. A sociocultural framing can dramatically change the nature of the observations we set out to pursue and the interpretations and meanings we ascribe to them. Richard's paper gives us some wonderful examples of that evidentiary reasoning process and its implications for understanding student performance. This leads me to the third important cross-cutting theme for these presentations: fairness, equity, and standardization. Each of the 5 papers make important points about this theme, albeit in different and complementary ways. What is so remarkable is that something that has always been cast as a means of promoting fairness and equity, the process of standardization in educational assessment, can now be seen in a very different light. In many ways, this can be the epitome of unfairness and inequity in the appraisal of human talent. Why is this so? And why has it taken us so long to realize this? It is because we have been slow in moving from a normative, homogeneous, and rationalist model of knowing and learning to a sociocultural framing of knowing and learning. And with that reconceptualization of the most fundamental vertex of the assessment triangle, we can begin to see how much we have constrained the observational and interpretive parts of the process of reasoning from evidence. I might be so bold as to argue that what Ed Gordon has been telling us all along is that our conceptualization of the process of knowing and learning was weak and impoverished. We needed to come around to his sociocultural way of thinking and its implications for assessment. So let me turn to my final cross-cutting theme, that of validity. As a field, we've come to understand that an assessment is neither valid nor invalid per se. Rather, the validity of an assessment, be it an instrument or a process, is a function of its intended interpretive use. And that validity is also the function of an argument based on evidence. The nature, forms, and quality of that evidence and their assembly into a validity argument will vary depending on the assessment context and use, be it formal or informal, formative or summative, diagnostic or predictive. And so we cannot ignore validity and the careful assemblage of evidence in support of an assessment's validity as we pursue the goals of developing and using educative assessments, whatever form they may take. For to ignore validity in our quest to use assessment to support human learning and development would be a failure to honor Ed's commitment to scholarly and rigorous thinking in making use of research in the service of humanity. Thank you again for inviting me to offer some thoughts on educative assessment and for the opportunity to express my personal appreciation to Ed for what he has taught me and so many others. I will end my remarks with a very appropriate toast in Italian. A Cindan, to 100 years, and may there be many more, Ed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim, for those thoughtful comments. And that was such a great synthesis of what everyone has said. Our quest to use assessments to support learning and development continues, but with the ideas from members of this panel, including you, I think we will find some answers. There might be a question from the audience waiting to be answered, and let us see what that might be. To all speakers, in light of these conversations about updating classical notions of assessment, how do you feel about letter grades? Should they be kept as is, updated, or discarded outright? Shall we just go in order? Anyone?
I will say a few things. One is that letter grades evolved to work best when you had the factory model where everybody in the classroom was doing the same thing, and you see how much everybody is able to accomplish under those standard conditions. The projects that I've worked with that didn't depend on grades, although there were grades imposed afterwards because the schools needed them or wanted them, have been the AP Studio Art portfolio assessments and the assessments in the Cisco networking academies. And both of them, students are able to progress in their own directions with a lot of diagnostic feedback along the way. In AP Studio Art, conversations with teachers and their other students. In Cisco, those conversations, but also feedback in automated systems where they practice designing and learning. And there, an indication of how you're doing, what you've learned, what you can come from, is through the curriculum in those areas. What are you working on? It's sort of like when kids learn gymnastics, maybe they're on level 4. How well are they doing on the kinds of things you work on in level 4? And a kid will tell you, I'm in level 4 and I just started, so I'm not real good, but I'm getting better. Or another kid is saying, yeah, I'm in level 4, but I'm about to move to level 5. And that tells you a lot more than a letter grade does, because it communicates in this sphere of valued activity how they're coming along in their own progress.
Thanks. Yes. So it's setting them free to follow their paths and develop. Anyone else have a thought on that?
Well, I would add to what Bob said that another way of calculating, if you will, what a grade is to look at not just how well people do within a particular domain, but how many domains people attempt in a serious way. To break out of the lockstep story, we need to find ways to give credit for people seeking opportunities, even seeking chances to fail, rather than staying on the same path as everyone else.
I would just add one other thing, which comes from the literature about feedback and grades. And we know that if we give students feedback, which is beneficial to help them understand where they're at and what they can do, if we give them grades simultaneously, they ignore the feedback. And so the grades are not feedback in the sense that we think they are, and they actually oftentimes get in the way of some of what Bob was talking about, which is productive information about where students are on their journey.
Yes, yes. So if the grades can be made a little more educative, then the information aligned with those grades will be more informative for the learners and the learning processes. Anyone else wants to respond, or shall we move to the next question?
I'll add something.
Yes.
Here, I think what I see here is, a route where it's a dialogic opportunity. Hit me. And
Yes.
what did you see? What did I intend? How can we understand what you were seeing and what I was doing? And do I understand what you're trying to say was not ideal or optimal? So I think kind of a dialogic approach, if there were resources and time to be able to understand how people are making sense of each other in a way that affects thinking about tasks and performance is valuable, but that's so expensive in terms of effort, and it's about relationships. So, I mean, there is that dimension to it as well. So,
yes, human-to-human connections, that's the foundation of the education process. That's what our professor tells us. Next question, please. Given the political entrenchment of governmentally funded and benchmarked standardized assessments, how do we, in practical terms, sprint away from them, rescue assessment from corporate interests? The politics.
Well, again, I can say something from the point of view of what might be considered a corporate interest. Working for ETS for a long time, I know that what we try to do is improve assessments, but also keep the lights on. We build assessments for people who want to use them, and that includes when we do things like NAEP. We continually look for ways to expand what is done and to do them different. But also those projects that I talked about before, AP Studio Art and the Cisco Networking Academy simulation-based learning, we were partners, we were collaborators on that too. So it's part of doing better with what you have, but on the side, not necessarily as desired by the big machine, showing what can be done so that the big machine eventually says, oh, enough people really want this other thing instead, that I guess we'll have to do that.
I would argue that we need to find the sweet spot of subversiveness.
Yeah.
When we developed the dynamic learning maps alternate assessment, which is a federally mandated accountability test, we could have taken the time-honored approach of focusing on what's best for accountability and adding on some bells and whistles to make it not too harmful or even possibly slightly helpful for understanding and helping students learn. Instead, we turned that on its head. We said, we're going to develop the best test that we can to help students learn and to help teachers teach while minimally meeting any requirements for accountability purposes. And there are many cases where we do have enough wiggle room that we can do things like that.
Yeah, the adjacent possible.
Yeah.
I think it speaks to the issue that Eva was putting before us. How do we shed the conceptions we have? How do we convince communities that and create a demand? I mean, we look at it as a law of supply and demand. If we don't have the demand, we won't have the supply. So how do we have to make students and their parents and teachers the consumers rather than the entities who use the results of large-scale assessments? Because those who are tested are not the ones who benefit from those assessments.
So I'm sorry.
No, I just wanted to turn it over to you because Jim mentioned you.
No, well, first of all, I want to thank the person who, Jonathan, who sent the question in, who is a core member of our seminar on, as some of you will know, on the development of a new view of assessment. So thank you, Jonathan. Not an easy question, but I happen to think, and I think it's probably contentious, that some of the changes that are being wrought relative to admissions testing, coming from the University of California, for example, may be the kind of opening that will allow places like ETS and others to expand their markets in a different way than they have up to this point, because I think the demand is going to be quite different. People still want to know about quality and potential of students. They now, I think, want to expand their interest to a broader array of students than we have focused on in the past. And that's a big challenge. And I would hope that when we say corporate, we think about agile corporations that adapt to the kinds of needs that people have. And my guess, of course, is we're all aware of the ever expanding and accelerating development of technologies that can help us. I think the big challenge in all of that is not only to open things up, but also to try and do so with clarity and some level of transparency so people know what it is people are asking for. But I think this is the time, maybe when the stars come together in such a way that that the people who know how to do all of this business can change their perspective and move to a different kind of a market.
Let me ask a question building on that to Ryan. From his data science and data analytics perspective, how do you think and where do you think we are in educating the public, parents, children, families, larger entities in the organization and governments with regard to using data analytics and data science informatively for better assessment?
I mean, I think thank you for the question. I think we're way behind where we could be. I think that that the public understanding of data science and what it can do and what it can't do and what the limitations are and what the risks are, but also what the opportunities are, is just, it's relatively far behind. We all know that there's these magic boxes that you'd speak to and they somehow understand you. But people being able to understand how that can be used for assessment, we're still well behind. And it's been a major goal of mine to try to educate people about what's possible. I think relating to the previous question, I think in some ways, there will be a role for larger organizations in this, because data science works best when you have lots of data, and you only get lots of data when you have things that are scaled, and scaling is hard for a university professor without any organizational support. So I think that there are a lot of good people who are going to be working on these problems, and working with them will be a way that we can help data science play its full role in assessment.
All right. Let's see if we have another question from the audience. Thank you, Ryan. Oh, I think we're out of time. This has been marvelous, really, for me, and I'm sure it was for the audience as well. I hope you've enjoyed talking to one another. I loved reading your papers and scrolling through the slides really quickly. But thank you, Jim, for coming and discussing the papers, because your thoughts were remarkably valuable. Thank you all. Bye-bye. Enjoy the rest of the time.